My name is Daniel Cross. I'm 33 years old. I grew up in a small town just outside Denver, raised by a father who believed discipline was love and silence was strength. He was a successful man, a lawyer, sharp-tongued and respected, but he never quite figured out how to be a father. I spent my life trying to earn his approval, his praise, anything that felt like real affection. I got degrees, landed a stable job in finance, and never caused trouble. But none of it ever seemed enough. Still, I never expected the betrayal to be public, cruel and deliberate. It happened on his 65th birthday. The house was packed with family, friends, colleagues, people who had known me since I was in diapers. My father stood at the center of the room, a scotch in one hand, smug as ever. He loved grand gestures. That night, he made one I'll never forget. He tapped his glass, cleared his throat, and with a sly grin said, "I've updated my will. Just so everyone knows, Daniel won't be in it." Turns out he's not my biological son. The room froze. Then came the laughter, nervous at first, then louder, except from me. I stood completely still. I remember the burn in my throat, the sting behind my eyes, but I didn't blink. I just stared at him, unmoving. That was the moment I understood. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to explode, to lash out, to prove something. Instead, I walked forward slowly and placed my gift on the table in front of him. It was just a plain envelope. No bow, no card, one single folded piece of paper inside. As I placed it down, I locked eyes with him, quiet, calm, controlled. Then I reached down and tore the envelope straight through, ripping the paper inside into shreds. A few gasps echoed. Someone tried to laugh it off. My father stared at the pieces like they were bones. I turned and walked out without saying a word. That was the last time I ever entered his house. He didn't know it yet, but I hadn't walked away in shame. I had walked away in power. You see, that paper wasn't just a gift. It was a message. And what he didn't realize was, it had everything he once held over me, signed and sealed in legal ink. But to understand how it came to this, to understand what he'd just lost, you'd have to go back. Back to every moment I stayed silent when I shouldn't have, every clue I missed, every cruel smirk I ignored. If you've ever been blindsided by someone you trusted, someone who raised you, then you know revenge doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be certain. Comment. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Growing up, I always sensed there was something different in the way my father looked at me. He wasn't abusive, not in the traditional sense, but his praise always had an expiration date. His affection came with strings, and his silence was louder than any shout. I convinced myself that if I just worked harder, succeeded more, he'd eventually see me, that he'd be proud, that he'd say it. "That's my son." But he never did. Not once in 33 years. I remember small moments that used to sting, but now make perfect sense. The way he'd introduce me to colleagues without saying "my son." The way he'd leave me out of family photos and claim it was a mistake. I was 14 the first time I asked him if he loved me. He said love is shown in responsibilities, not words. Then handed me a list chores. I thought that was wisdom. Now I know it was evasion. But I still stayed. I still loved him. Because when you're a kid, you don't want truth. You want belonging. My mother, God rest her, never once hinted at any secret. She passed when I was 22, just before I graduated. Her death changed him, but not in the way you'd expect. He became sharper, colder, almost like without her he no longer had to pretend. That was when the distance really turned into walls. I remember thinking maybe grief had just swallowed him. But I didn't realize then what was actually unraveling behind those walls. Even after her death, I never asked questions. I never suspected that I might not be his biological son. I'd inherited her features, her eyes, her way of standing with my arms crossed, her love for quiet evenings. But here I had studied to mirror his ambition, his discipline, even his emotional restraint. I built my life in the image of a man who never intended to build anything with me. And yet, I remained loyal. Birthdays, holidays, hospital visits, I was always there. I'd help organize his files when his eyesight started to fail, drive him to court hearings when his knee gave out. I even handled the messy legal battle when one of his clients tried to sue him over malpractice, all without asking for recognition. Because deep down, I believed loyalty would prove my worth, that he would see me and think, this is what a son does. But instead, he waited until a crowded room, until his moment of power, to strike the final blow. That I wasn't really his, that everything I had done was meaningless in his eyes. He didn't realize that in trying to shame me, he handed me freedom because I had nothing left to lose, and more truth than he could ever handle. The moment I walked out of that party, something in me shifted. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity, not the kind that comes from vengeance, but the kind that comes from finally seeing someone for who they are. He wanted me to crumble. He wanted to reclaim control by cutting the last string he thought tethered me to him. But what he didn't realize was I had been preparing for that moment for over a year, quietly, legally, meticulously. You see, a year before the party, I started noticing odd behavior. He was growing paranoid about money, about control. He'd ask me to look over documents, transfer funds, digitize files. I thought it was a show of trust, but it was more of a test. He was grooming someone to carry his legacy, while secretly drafting a different future. That's when I found it. Buried in an old drawer, under folders of case notes and personal junk, was a notarized document he had forgotten to destroy, an older version of his will, one where I was the primary beneficiary of his estate. He must have had it rewritten afterward, probably around the time he started suspecting that I was asking too many questions. But what he didn't expect was that I made a copy of that first will. And not just a copy, I had it reviewed, certified and sealed by an outside attorney, one with no ties to him or his firm. It wasn't about money. It was about proof. Proof that he once acknowledged me, legally, as his heir. Proof that he was rewriting history to hurt me, not because it was true, but because he wanted to rewrite the past in his favor. I also began pulling threads, quietly. I contacted an old family friend, a retired attorney who once worked with my father in his early days. I asked about a woman named Teresa, the name I found scribbled in the margins of that old will. The hesitation in his voice confirmed everything. Teresa had been my mother's best friend, and from the way he spoke, I realized my father's betrayal wasn't just legal, it was personal. There were whispers of affairs, cover-ups, and a silent promise my mother must have made to protect me from the truth. That's when it hit me. My mother had known. She had known I wasn't his, and yet she fought to make sure I was treated as his equal. She must have threatened to leave if he disowned me. And after her death, he saw no more reason to pretend. But I wasn't going to let her sacrifice be in vain. I was going to honor her, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a plan so quiet, so deliberate, he wouldn't even see it coming until it was far too late. So I began preparing the gift, the one I would give him at that birthday party. I took that certified will and folded it neatly into a white envelope. No card, no note, just one paper, one truth. I wanted him to see what he had thrown away, and then I'd let him watch it be torn in front of a room full of witnesses. That moment wasn't the revenge, it was just the beginning. In the weeks after the party, my father tried to act like nothing had happened, Classic power move. He sent a short text. "Hope you're not taking it personally." I didn't respond. Instead, I let silence wrap around me like armor. I stopped answering his calls. I didn't show up to his firm's board meeting, even though I was invited as a silent observer. The man who once controlled every room now had to sit in one without knowing if I'd walk through the door. I didn't, and that was the first crack in his illusion of control. What he didn't realize was that I'd already begun speaking to two of his key clients. Quiet conversations, nothing confrontational, just professional check-ins. They had both relied on me in recent years to prepare financial briefs and risk assessments. So when I asked them to review their account standings with a new advisory group I had joined, they agreed without hesitation. Within a month, over $1.7 million in assets were in motion, away from my father's firm. It wasn't sabotage, it was realignment, strategic, clean, and legal. Meanwhile, I made sure he saw the consequences unfold. Subtle reminders, an email thread forwarded by mistake, a calendar alert on a shared system we once used. The look on his face, the one time we crossed paths at the courthouse, pure confusion tinged with growing panic. He hadn't just lost a son. He was losing the only person who knew his empire's cracks from the inside, the only one who could see how fragile his walls really were. And then came the press inquiry. A journalist reached out to me about an old case my father had buried, an ethics complaint from 2 decades ago that mysteriously disappeared. I didn't leak it, but I didn't stop it either. The reporter had questions. I simply pointed them to public records that were overlooked. I gave no statement. I didn't need to. My silence became its own kind of confession, the kind that makes people wonder what else you know. One by one, board members started to whisper. Investors began pulling back. Even his secretary, the one who had been with him for 12 years, quit without warning. She'd seen too much. And while he scrambled to patch the holes, I kept moving quietly, shifting my future into place, piece by piece. Not to destroy him, but to build a life where he held no part of the foundation. That's the thing about power. It's not about who shouts the loudest. It's about who knows when to walk away, when to wait, and when to let gravity do the work for you. He had built his empire on silence. Now mine was dismantling it. I never showed up to confront him. Not once. That was the part he couldn't understand. He waited, expected me to barge into his office, to demand answers, maybe even beg, but there was nothing left to beg for. I watched from a distance as his pride did all the work. He tried to reclaim clients, calling in favors, offering discounts, rewriting contracts. But the damage wasn't about money, it was about credibility. And credibility, once fractured, doesn't bounce back with charm or legal jargon. Eventually, he called my aunt, his sister. The same woman who once told me I was the only good thing he ever did right. She asked if I'd consider talking to him, maybe help ease tensions, restore what was lost. I told her gently, nothing was lost. It was never mine to begin with, and for the first time, I think even she understood what he'd done, what he had always done. He didn't just reject me, he erased me, and I chose not to let him rewrite the ending. Then came the letter. Handwritten, 4 pages, shaky penmanship. He didn't apologize, of course not, but he danced around it. Phrases like mistakes were made and things were complicated. He said he hoped I understood now that the world isn't black and white, that sometimes men make hard choices. I read it once. Then I slid it into a drawer and never opened it again. I wasn't angry. I was done. You don't owe closure to the one who slammed the door. The firm began to fold slowly. A partner stepped down. Another left to start her own office. Clients moved on, one after the other. Reputation matters in law, and when your name starts becoming a whisper instead of a headline, you lose your grip. I never celebrated his fall. I didn't smile or toast it with friends. I just kept building quietly. I launched my own firm 6 months later. Different name, different ethos. Transparency, integrity. I hired people he would have never looked twice at, and they bloomed. Some nights I still think of my mother. I wonder if she saw all this coming. If she knew the man she married would eventually undo himself. I think she did. That's why she left those breadcrumbs for me to find. Her journals, her will. That old photograph tucked behind my childhood bookshelf with the note, "Daniel, you are more than where you came from." At the time, I didn't understand it. Now I do. She didn't want me to be his legacy. She wanted me to be free from it. That's the thing about quiet revenge. It doesn't look like victory to the world. It looks like peace. It looks like walking away from a fire you didn't start but refused to fuel. It looks like never looking back. I didn't return to that house. Not for holidays, not for family gatherings, not even when my aunt begged me to come by just once for the sake of peace. But peace doesn't live in places where you were made to feel invisible. I learned that the hard way. Some spaces you don't reclaim, you replace them. And I had started building new ones with people who saw me, not just my usefulness. Eventually, the firm was absorbed by a larger legal group in a quiet deal that stripped his name off the signage. I only found out because someone emailed me a photo. The building I once helped maintain, where I sorted files for free every summer in college, now bore the name of someone else. The irony was sharp. He lost what he built not through scandal or fire, but through silence, through the quiet retreat of every bridge he thought would never burn. There's a myth people like him believe, that if they build something big enough, loud enough, they'll live forever through it. But a name carved into stone is still just stone. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't love. It doesn't bleed for you when you're gone. I think he finally realized that as the calls stopped coming, as the chairs around his table stayed empty. And me, I didn't rise from spite. I rose from clarity, from knowing what not to be, from refusing to spend the rest of my life proving something to a man who never intended to see me clearly. My firm began thriving, not because I was aggressive, but because I was honest. We built slow, we built real, and people noticed. Word travels fast when authenticity meets excellence. There were nights when I imagined writing back to him. I'd even draft a line or two in my head. "You didn't break me, you freed me." But I never put pen to paper. Some truths are best kept within, not out of fear, but because they've already done their work. I didn't need him to read them, I needed to live them. By the end of that year, I had reached a kind of peace I didn't know existed. Not the kind that comes after revenge, but the kind that comes after release. He was no longer my enemy. He was simply the past. I legally changed my last name that winter, not out of anger, but intention. I didn't want to carry his name into rooms where I was building something new, something honest. I chose my mother's maiden name instead. Cross. Simple, clean. The name of the woman who chose to love me, the name that held truth, not control. It felt like shedding the final layer of a skin I never asked to wear. When I signed the papers, I didn't expect to feel much, but I sat in my car for 20 minutes afterward, holding the receipt in my hands, and for the first time in my life, I cried. Not from grief, but from relief. That weight, it was gone. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to breathe in full, enough to stand taller without needing anyone's permission. The name change made waves. My cousins called, some confused, others supportive. A few accused me of turning my back on family, But they didn't see the truth because they didn't live it. Blood might be thicker than water, but character is stronger than both. And when a family forgets to protect its own, loyalty becomes a prison. I hosted my first company retreat that spring. 35 employees, a mix of newcomers and old friends who believed in what we were building. I stood in front of them and spoke, not like my father used to, from a podium with a mask of superiority, but openly. I told them our values. I told them my story. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. They understood what it meant to build with integrity because they had felt what it meant to be trusted. Somewhere in that process, I stopped needing to win. I stopped needing him to see me. He'd already seen me and still chose to erase me. But the version he dismissed wasn't the one who survived. I survived, and I didn't just survive, I evolved. I built a name I was proud of, a place people felt safe working in, and a life that didn't require validation from a man incapable of giving it. I no longer needed to destroy his legacy. I had simply replaced it with something better. Not louder, just truer. It was almost a year to the day after that birthday party when I got the call. My father had suffered a mild stroke. Not fatal, but enough to slow him down. Enough to change the tone of the people around him. Suddenly, the man who had ruled his circles with arrogance was now dependent, frail, human. The nurse on the line said he had asked to see me. I paused, not out of hesitation, but reflection. Would seeing him bring closure or reopen wounds? I drove to the hospital the next morning, alone, no dramatics, no announcement. I walked into his room and stood quietly by the doorway. He looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders hunched, hands trembling slightly. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in my life, they held something I never expected: uncertainty, not dominance, not control. Just a man realizing he had reached the end of his story and wasn't sure how it would be remembered. He opened his mouth to speak, but I gently raised a hand. I didn't want apologies. I didn't want revision. I simply said, I came to say goodbye. Not to you, but to the version of me that kept waiting. He swallowed hard. I could see the words forming, but I knew he wasn't ready to say what mattered. Maybe he never would be, and maybe that was okay. Some people don't get redemption arcs. Some people simply fade, slowly, into the silence they once demanded from others. I left a photo on the table next to him. It was of my mother, young, vibrant, holding me at age 4, smiling in a way that told the world I was hers. I didn't leave a note. He'd know what it meant. She had chosen me. She had shielded me. And now her legacy lived in me, not in him. That was the final thread cut, and I walked out without looking back. Not out of defiance, but freedom. That night, I slept without dreams. No replaying memories, no what-ifs, just peace, cold, quiet peace. The kind that doesn't roar, but whispers, "You're finally done." And in that silence, I heard my future speaking for the first time, clearly, calmly, with no trace of his voice left in it. Months passed, and life moved forward. My firm expanded, new clients, a second office, a team that felt more like family than anything I had known growing up. But one evening, while organizing old boxes in my apartment, I found it, his letter. The one he had written after the party. I had tucked it away without reading it a second time. I sat down at my kitchen table, held the paper like it was fragile glass, and finally read it again. This time, not as a wounded son, but as a whole man. It was riddled with deflections, masked regret, and an almost clinical tone of reflection. I did the best I could, he wrote. I never promised perfection. But that was the problem. He never promised anything. Not love, not trust, not belonging. He offered conditions, transactional love, earned approval. His final paragraph admitted something close to the truth. I think I always feared you weren't mine, so I never let myself love you like you were. There it was, not confirmation but confession. Half of one, anyway. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just folded the letter back up, placed it in a clean envelope and scribbled across the front, "Return to sender." I drove to the cemetery 2 days later, not to visit his grave, but to bury the envelope beneath a tree at the edge of the lot. I didn't mark it. I didn't linger. It wasn't about him. It was about me. About choosing to stop carrying a voice that had once tried to erase mine. In that moment I wrote a letter of my own, in my head. Just a few words. I imagined saying, "You didn't break me. You built the man who would never become you." That was enough. No audience, no stage, just the final full stop on a sentence that had once defined my life. From that day forward, I lived differently. My mornings didn't begin with old thoughts. My decisions didn't consider his possible judgment. I no longer played out conversations with a ghost. I had, without realizing it, forgiven him, not to free him, but to free me, because holding on to what he did meant he still held part of me, and I was done giving him anything. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't always about grace. Sometimes it's about releasing the final thread that ties you to the pain, quietly, completely. After his death, the lawyer handling his estate reached out to me. I almost didn't answer the call. I had assumed there'd be nothing left for me. No mention, no gesture, not even a line of acknowledgement, but curiosity outweighed indifference. And I agreed to meet. The office was sterile, old, familiar in a way that made my skin tighten. The lawyer, a man I vaguely remembered from my childhood, handed me a thin folder and said, "He asked that this be given to you directly." Inside were two things: a worn photograph of me, age 7, sitting on my father's shoulders at a 4th of July picnic, and a post-it note stuck to the back. 4 words, scribbled in rushed ink. "I always saw you." My chest didn't ache. My hands didn't shake. I just stared at it for a long time, letting the weight of that small sentence rest in the silence. I didn't know if it was a lie or a delayed truth, but it didn't matter anymore. He could have seen me. He just chose not to show it. I signed the release forms without reading the rest. The will left everything to charity, every asset, every account. There was nothing to fight over, no legal battle, just a quiet end to a loud man's story. I walked out of that office feeling strangely light, like I had closed a door that no longer had hinges. Nothing about that moment changed my past, but it confirmed something I had already learned. Validation doesn't come from being written into a will. It comes from writing your own. In the weeks that followed, I put away the photo, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed proof of anything. I had built a life without his permission. I had turned pain into progress, silence into structure. I started mentoring young professionals, especially those with complicated families, broken ties, missing fathers. I taught them what no one had taught me: how to walk away with dignity, how to build without bitterness, how to win quietly. I never changed my story to make him look better. I didn't rewrite it for sympathy or revenge. I just lived it fully, and in doing so, I became the kind of man I would have wanted to raise me. One who keeps his promises. One who doesn't flinch at truth. One who knows love is a choice, not a reward. I now live in a home filled with warmth, not because of grandeur or design, but because every corner holds something chosen, not inherited. A bookshelf of my mother's novels, a photo of my team after our first year of profit, a wall covered in thank you notes from young professionals I've mentored. There are no portraits of my father, not out of spite, but out of intention. I don't memorialize pain. I learn from it, and then I move forward. People often think revenge is loud, a courtroom battle, a ruined name, a shattered empire. But real revenge, it's silent, it's slow, it's the ability to thrive in spaces they never expected you to survive. It's creating a life they no longer have access to, a life so whole, so rooted in peace, that their absence is not a wound but a blessing. I'm married now. My wife knows the story, every detail, and yet she never once pitied me. She saw a man who chose healing over hatred. We're expecting our first child, a boy, and I've already made him one quiet promise. I will never make you earn my love. You won't have to wonder if you belong. You won't have to perform to be seen. You'll just know every single day that you were always wanted. Sometimes I still hear my father's voice in my head, sharp and clipped, judging the path I took, but it fades quickly, overpowered by the sound of laughter in my home, the rhythm of my own heartbeat when I'm building something that matters. His voice is no longer the narrator of my life. It's just background noise in a story that no longer belongs to him. The truth is, I don't wish him harm. I don't wish him pain. I wish him understanding wherever he is now. I hope he finally knows what he couldn't admit, that love isn't earned through obedience or success, but through presence, through choice, through courage. And as for me, I've already written my will. It's short, direct, and clear. But the real legacy won't be on paper. It will be in the silence I broke, the peace I built, and the son who will never have to wonder if he was enough, because he will know. I always saw him.